institutions and political and academic debates in civil society. A few months after the book's released, the Australia government approved a sweeping set of national security legislation banning foreign interference in politics. And this issue of Chinese influence in democracies is a growing issue in many countries, including here in Washington. There have been several hearings in the China Commission on Capitol Hill on this subject, and of course, most recently, Vice President Pence gave a speech a couple of weeks ago at the Hudson Institute where he really laid out his concerns about Chinese influence and interference in American politics, which is something that we'll get into. We planned this event, by the way, before we knew about that speech, but it is now quite timely. So I will turn to Mr. Hamilton in a moment, but I also want to introduce our other speaker today in this conversation, which is Bonnie Glaser. She's a senior advisor for Asia and the director of the China Power Project here at CSIS. So let me begin with Mr. Hamilton and ask him to give a few opening remarks, sort of an overview of your book and the arguments in it.
Thanks very much, Amy. Yes, so far as one can, just give a kind of few tasters of the argument and what's been going on in Australia and the kind of interference activity that the CCP has been engaged in. Well, the long-term objective of the Chinese Communist Party in Australia is to absorb Australia into its sphere of influence and to shift Australia away from its alliance with the United States. That's its ultimate objective. And Beijing sees Australia as a weak link in the American alliance, as a European nation located in Asia and therefore a major prize in its push for strategic hegemony in the Asia-Pacific region and ultimately across the globe. And so, as I say, demonstrate at length in the book Silent Invasion, the CCP has been engaged in a thoroughgoing and systematic campaign to shift elite opinion in Australia so that decision makers act in ways conformable with Beijing's wishes. And we can see that it's been highly successful when we look at the number of senior leaders and opinion makers in the business and political and intellectual communities in Australia who essentially take a Beijing-friendly position. Over several decades, the Communist Party, has built a complex network of agencies tasked with exerting influence abroad. And these agencies deploy sophisticated techniques to influence, persuade, and coerce others to act in ways approved by Beijing. And these techniques, which can be found in classified manuals, in fact they have been uncovered by one or two researchers, these techniques of persuasion and indeed coercion have far more extensive, intrusive and secretive than those used by other nations. The moral equivalence argument, while every country exerts this kind of practice these kinds of influence operations, it really simply doesn't hold when we're comparing the United States, for example, with the PRC. So in the West, in particular, United Front work which has traditionally been aimed at the diasporas in various countries around the world, including in Australia and the United States, has increasingly shifted towards influencing mainstream opinion. And United Front work aims to influence the choices, the directions and loyalties of those targeted by overcoming negative perceptions of CCP rule and promoting favourable ones. And the psychological techniques that are applied have, as I've said, been developed and refined over the decades by the CCP, and they're very effective tools that we've discovered in Australia for intensive behavioural control and manipulation, but always in ways that appear to be benign, benevolent and helpful. So let me just give a few illustrations of the kinds of influence activities that have been practiced in Australia. These are kind of stylised versions of actual events, and which are also being practiced in other countries like Canada, where I've recently been, New Zealand, in Europe, certainly in Central and Eastern Europe, and to a greater or lesser degree in the United States. And I actually think to a greater degree. It's just that in the United States, people haven't been looking hard enough yet. So, for example, a wealthy donor, Chinese or Chinese-Australian donor with demonstrable links to the CCP, privately gives a donation to a political party and through that way gains influence and starts to communicate how the target should view the world from a Beijing point of view. An organisation acting at the behest of a PRC consulate mobilises members in the diaspora to disrupt a legitimate demonstration by Tibetan autonomy supporters and intimidate those taking part. Or in the midst of an election campaign, a united front group at the behest of the PRC consulate circulates within the ethnic Chinese community, of whom there are quite a lot of voters in certain electorates, denouncing one candidate as being anti-China and promoting another. Other examples that have happened are wealthy individuals with close but hidden links to the party funds the establishment of a think tank at an Australian university, chooses its director, and makes sure that the founding principles and operations of that think tank are all sympathetic to Beijing. The think tank in question is one run by Bob Carr. A former Prime Minister is invited onto the board of an important institution in China. He soon begins to see the world through Chinese eyes. A leading opinion maker at home, he argues Beijing's case consistently, often reproducing propaganda points from official state media. A couple more examples of influence operations in Australia. A wealthy businessman with close links to the CCP buys up Chinese language newspapers, changes the editorial orientation so that they consistently promote the interests of Beijing. 20, 30 years ago, Australia had a very vibrant, diverse Chinese language media. Now, over 90% of Chinese language newspapers and radio stations all take a pro-Beijing line. A Chinese consulate official complains to a senior university official about a lecturer who refers to Taiwan as an independent country in a lecture or tutorial. The Deputy Vice-Chancellor then reminds the lecturer that while she's free to say whatever she likes, of course, the university does derive hundreds of millions of dollars from Chinese students. The PRC has been extremely effective at weaponising business links in Australia, cultivation of warm personal relationships, which are then used at the appropriate moment to mobilise businesses to apply pressure to their government. I was surprised when I visited Taiwan a few months ago that they actually have a phrase for this, forgive my pronunciation, but it's Yi Shang Bi Zheng, use business to apply pressure. Legal warfare or lawfare, which was in fact endorsed in an editorial in the People's Daily in December of last year, where the law in the West is used as an offensive weapon to hamstring opponents. And this is all part of, and I'll finish on this point, a program of political warfare using a vast and complex and sophisticated apparatus of persuasion, interference and coercion, including where necessary geoeconomics or economic blackmail, which of course the PRC is the master at. So when it comes to diplomacy, the PRC, I'll just finish on this point, uses the same tools as the United States or Canada or Australia to apply pressure on other nations to achieve its diplomatic goals, but it also has several other powerful weapons at its disposal for subduing other nations. And these other weapons, the kinds of things that I've been talking about, are aimed not at applying outside pressure on other nations, but at eroding resistance from within. So the PRC is always looking for ways of infiltrating the political, economic and social and academic institutions, indeed military and intelligence ones, in order to white-hand opposition to Beijing from within. And so while other nations diplomatically work on a traditional, two-track path. PRC is working on a, say, 8-track campaign to apply pressure, not only from without, using the normal diplomatic and international means of pressure, but also at winning friends and influencing people from within the host government so as to erode resistance to Beijing's will, or to start to see Beijing, to start to see a concordance between the interests of one's own country and the interests of China.
Thank you, Clive. I think one critique of your work is that the way that you characterize Chinese influence operations as a threat on the institutions of Australia may be overblown. And I guess the way I would want to ask the question is, if China has all of these techniques and they are such a problem, then how is it that the Australian government managed to pass these laws to counter Chinese influence? And you have had recent prime ministers like Malcolm Turnbull, who has taken some pretty tough policies on China and given some
Yes.
rather critical speeches, including one he just gave at CSIS last 2 weeks ago. Very tough kind of public remarks on China. So, you know, are the Chinese really effective if the debate in Australia is as vibrant and as critical of China as it is now?
Well, I think the answer to your question, Amy, is that those laws were instituted, plus a range of administrative measures, because we got there just in time. I mean, I think that if that the pushback in Australia had been left for another 5 years or maybe even 2 years, it would have been impossible. I think the level of influence and persuasion and the winning over of elite opinion, plus the capacity to exert economic blackmail, would have been so intense that we wouldn't have had the kind of debate, and we would not have had the kind of legislative response that we have had in Australia. There's a kind of very good case study. I just mentioned that I'd been in Canada, where Canada is some maybe 3 or 4 years behind Australia in this. And there is, I think, a real question of whether Canada will not push back, will leave it so late in taking measures to resist PRC influence that in another couple of years' time, it will just be too difficult. There are people in Australia, incidentally, who believe that it is already too late, that the measures that we've taken will not be effective at repelling the kind of influence operations that Beijing has already achieved in Australia.
A question I want to ask both of you, I'll start with you, Clive, and then I'll ask Bonnie the same question. How should we think about Chinese influence and the difference between influence and intervention? This is something that John Garneau has pointed to, this distinction, and Bonnie, you just told me that, John Brennan mentioned the same made the same distinction recently on television. In other words, and you've mentioned this, all large countries engage in influence activities, including the United States. It's called public diplomacy. We seek to shape views of the United States and our policies and views about the region. And certainly China's engaging in those legitimate activities. But you seem to point to techniques that are secretive and manipulative. And how do you draw that distinction, or do you see a distinction between legitimate public diplomacy and influence activities and attempts to intervene and disrupt institutions?
Yeah, I actually think this is a kind of a non-problem, really. I mean, interference is influence that, using the Australian terminology, is covert, coercive or corrupt. And in fact, if you look at Australia's foreign interference law, which was passed by Parliament in June, if you're interested, section 92.2, which defines foreign interference, and it was really quite a substantial legislative drafting achievement to capture this new crime, as it now is in Australia, of foreign interference, and define it in a way that can be prosecuted in the courts. And what it says is extremely interesting. It says that foreign interference covers activities that are covert or threatening, are carried out on behalf of a foreign power and that are aimed at influencing government processes or the exercise of democratic rights. So the foreign interference legislation actually says we are criminalising forms of influence that are covert or threatening on behalf of a foreign power that try to influence government processes or the exercise of democratic rights. And so I think it's a pretty straightforward characterisation of the difference between those two terms.
Bonnie, let me ask you the same question. And, it seems to me that the United States uses some threats at times to try to shape policies of other governments by threatening to withhold aid or take other kinds of actions, tariffs, other sorts of things. So how do you draw the line in your mind, this distinction between what's legitimate and not legitimate in influence and interference?
Well, I do think that I agree with you on the issue of public diplomacy, that the United States has many efforts that it engages in. I like this distinction between influence and interference. I think influence is something that is transparent. It is done in accordance with law. We may use tariffs or sanctions, but it is in accordance with our laws in the United States. Mm-hmm. The Chinese, for example, don't have a law on sanctions, but they actually very quietly will use economic coercion against other countries when they don't like the policies that they're pursuing, such as with South Korea deploying THAAD. So to me, something that whatever actions that we are taking and that China is taking here in the United States or in other countries, at least should be in accordance with law and should be transparent. Mm-hmm. And so if we go back to, for example, Vice President Pence's speech, where he talked about China purchasing these advertisements in the Des Moines Register, which of course has been going on Washington Post and many other newspapers mm-hmm. around the world, they are labeled as advertisements. I don't like them. I wish that they were not there. But that said, I think that unless we are going to create a law that says that it's not legal to do that, unless we want to control our media and say who you can sell advertisements to, we are democracies, we are vulnerable as democracies. Mm-hmm. The Chinese certainly have their own laws that will ban the potential for any American or other foreign newspaper from buying ads, or foreign government from buying ads in their newspapers. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of people are talking about reciprocity, and it's a nice goal, mm-hmm. but China has a very different system than we do. I think we are not going to change it. And there are areas where maybe we can get some reciprocity, but the U.S. government is just not going to get ads in China's newspapers. So that's one example. And then, of course, the targeted tariffs, which Vice President Pence also mentioned, on particular parts of the country that voted for President Trump. Mm-hmm. That's also being done in a transparent way. The United States, I think, uses similar tools. So I don't like it. But where we have to be really worried is interference, which is covert, and it uses money. Mm-hmm. And that's where I think we have long had laws in the United States that ban foreign citizens from contributing to political candidates here. And if our intelligence agencies find this is being done in a way indirectly, then that is a problem.
So let me stick with you, Bonnie, and let's talk a little bit more about sort of a comparison of the United States and Australia. I mean, are there differences in your view about the ability of Chinese to use influence and interference efforts in the United States? You just pointed to, we have different laws on the books about money in political campaigns. But do you really want to limit things just to money? I mean, there's the pressure that comes on academic campuses to Chinese students who are studying there, monitoring by the embassies, those kinds of things. So can you talk a little bit broadly about the U.S. and what makes it similar and different to Australia or other countries? in this regard?
One area that I think the United States has a similar problem as Australia is our PRC citizens who are studying here in the United States. And that may also extend to those who now have green cards. Maybe they have some status here in the United States. And these student associations, the Scholars, Chinese Scholars Student Association, they're CSSAs. I know people who have headed some of these who actually say they never saw interference from the Chinese embassy. They would just get some money to hold the annual Chinese New Year reception. So we cannot say that this is true in every case, but there are cases in which Chinese who are studying here are being pressured. And that's a problem. It affects academic freedom. And so I think that's an area where I think the US government is quite concerned. I think in think tanks, and we can talk a little bit more about this later, that we don't have the same extent of problem. I don't think that we have a PRC funded think tank that has installed an American as the director of that think tank that is shaping the work that they're doing.
You're referring to the Bob Carr think tank,
yes, Bob Carr, the example that Clive gave in Australia. And some think tanks may take money from China, but I think that they decide what their research is. And I'm very confident in the 10 years that I've been here at CSIS that we decide our conclusions, the nature of our research, the way that we're going to approach research. But I think that there is a bigger problem, as my understanding is, in Australia than there is here in the United States on that score.
Clive, do you want to say a few more words about Australia, academics and think tanks, and is there a way to counter the problem in Australia?
Let me just give a little. I want to stress the notion of self-censorship because I think it operates at a far more subtle level than someone coming along and saying, we're going to fund your, so-and-so program at a university or think tank and don't you say anything that's contrary to Beijing. It doesn't work like that. If it did, it would be self-destructive. The Fairfax media 3 or 4 years ago took these inserts from the China Daily, the traditional media strapped for cash, Beijing, Xinhua, came from a Xinhua agreement, comes along and will give you X thousand, I don't know how much money if you carry these inserts. Very hard to resist this kind of free money. Everybody will know it's propaganda, it's not going to work at that level. And then I was speaking to opinion editors from both the Age, the sister newspapers, the Age and the Sydney Morning Herald, the Age in Melbourne. And I raised this question with the opinion editor, and one of them said, we have editorial independence, we will never be influenced by anything, you can trust us. And I thought, okay. And then I spoke to the other one from the Sydney Morning Herald, who said, we always have to be watch out, these things operate subtly, who knows what might happen, minds are easily bent. And I thought, that person's being honest. I mean, I've run a think tank, and you're always thinking about what is going to be the impact of what we publish on the people who give us money. I mean, if you run a think tank, you can't help thinking about that kind of thing. So you have to make an active decision. We are going to publish this even though we know it'll really annoy that person on whose money we depend. Now, some people do that. Many people don't. And it goes, and similarly in the universities, no vice-chancellor of an Australian university is going to issue a memo to all staff saying, you must not say anything that might upset Beijing. However, there's an enormous amount of self-censorship of academics, including, in fact, I'd say especially China scholars in Australia. A great deal of self-censorship, limiting what they say, being careful not to transgress those lines, and therefore effectively fulfilling the objectives of Beijing or Beijing-linked people in giving money or sending large numbers of students, or in particular often neglected, not just the money from Chinese students, but also money from collaborative agreements with Chinese universities. I don't know in the United States, but I'm guessing based on the Australian experience that there are hundreds of these that aren't talked about much. And they are on the minds of senior administrators of universities every single day.
Mm-hmm. Bonnie, I don't know how much you know about Chinese money in academia, Chinese funded programs, but Clive's point about academics, I think, is a good one. And in addition to money, one tool that China has is our visas. And scholars who are very critical of China sometimes find that they're unable to travel to China to do academic research. So from your perspective, is the American China scholar community affected in the way that Clive talks about?
Okay, before I answer that, I just want to make two very quick
Sure.
points. One is that it would be interesting to do a study where you could compare how the Washington Post maybe is covering certain controversial issues like the detention in concentration camps, essentially, of Uyghurs in Xinjiang, compared to other newspapers. And because they do take Chinese money for advertisements. And my guess is that you would find no difference. And so I just don't think that there are examples where, because the Chinese are buying advertising, that it's affecting their reporting. Maybe that's different in Australia. And I was going to highlight one other area where I think we have similar problems, although it's a bigger problem in Australia, is Chinese language media here in the United States. And it is partially or almost wholly owned, influenced by Chinese. So anybody who seeks news from in Chinese, there are a few organizations like Falun Gong that are obviously separate, and I'm sure those exist in Australia. So you have the Epoch Times, New Tang Dynasty, and others. But when it comes to the Chinese language media, there's been a lot of Chinese ownership and influence there, speaking to our Chinese language speaking citizens. So on your question of visas, I'll do a plug for an event that we're actually holding here next week, the Freeman Chair. Sheena Greitens and Rory Truex, who've done some very interesting work, interesting 500 China scholars in the United States about their research experiences in China. And also visas are a part of this. And they find, I think not surprisingly, that there's a tiny percentage of Americans who have been denied visas to go to China. But there's a lot of harassment when it comes to visas. And we all have personal experiences here. Sometimes you get your visa approved after your conference that you were supposed to participate has taken place. I personally was called up to the embassy. I'm the only American that I know of in a think tank that was called up to the embassy to have an interview. I was asked about what my assessment was of U.S.-China relations and whether I was going to actually, who I was going to be seeing in China for a conference that was hosted by Fu Ying. So this was an important conference on a joint project, actually, we were doing with China, which we didn't take any money for, by the way. But I see pressure and harassment regarding visa, but when it comes to denial, the cases are apparently quite small.
But
what
you
we
only
are
need
seeing,
a couple of cases in order to send a very clear message, and a very clear message has been sent to the China scholarly community that you risk your career. There are people like eminent scholars like David Shambaugh and a handful of others, and you think, I don't want to end up like that, particularly if you're
David Shambaugh's never been denied a visa,
particularly if you're a young
about
scholar.
So many, many years ago, there was a book that was published on Xinjiang, and the people who contributed to it were denied visas. And we certainly cannot say that there are no American scholars working on Xinjiang. There may be professors who tell students, you might put your career at risk, you might not be able to do your research, maybe you shouldn't do that. I don't rule that out. My guess is that is taking place. But there still are people, at least, who are studying that. So the other point that I was going to make was about academic study and what Sheena Greitens and Rory Truex report in their paper, which I think is, again, it goes to the issue of reciprocity. It's very difficult to do research in China. So people are called into tea and they're detained by the local police, and they may actually have their research materials seized from them or expelled by local governments. So it's very difficult if you're working on sensitive projects to do research in China these days. And yet, of course, Chinese can do any kind of research here. And that's an issue where I actually think we should be, our academics, universities who are jointly doing projects with Chinese and working with the Chinese and actually have schools in China, they should be pushing back on that.
Could I pick up on that,
Sure.
which I think is an extremely important issue, which is underexplored in both Australia and the US and elsewhere. I published with my former researcher, Alex Josky, a couple of reports last year, which are reproduced in my book, Silent Invasion. And we discovered that there are a significant number of scientists studying in Australian laboratories, Australian universities, who are actually officers in the People's Liberation Army. They are PLA scientists, and they're working in Australian universities on military-related research, sometimes with funding from the Australian government. And this was, when we uncovered this, it was a shock to even the intelligence agencies didn't know it, let alone the universities. The universities kind of went into denial, of course. And there's going to be a report coming out at the end of this month by Alex Josky, which is a much more extensive investigation of this issue. And I think, I haven't seen the report, but I believe that he will have many more instances of scientists who are in the PLA working in US universities doing military-related research. And so there is so much going on here that until you have skilled people like Alex Josky with the capacity to look deeply into the kinds of influence and the extent of the penetration of the PRC across all the institutions in the United States, then you won't have a full picture of what's happening. And I think this is why Vice President Pence's speech was so important, because suddenly people started to think, hey, maybe we've been distracted by Russia. Maybe Pence and others, like the intelligence chiefs, are right in saying that Russia is a short-term irritating disturbance, but in the long term, the PRC is the real issue for us.
I wanted to turn to Vice President Pence's speech. Bonnie, I want to get your take on his arguments, the specific examples he used, and there's been a lot of criticism of the speech that it was an attempt to distract from the concerns about the Trump administration and Russian interference, and the Mueller report that's going to come out, presumably have some news on that front. So a lot of speculation that this was an attempt to really put China out there as the big shiny object to deflect from Russia. He did make a lot of arguments in that speech about broad influence and interference in American elections and political debates and media and business and academia and think tanks. What are your takeaways from his arguments? Where do you think they were strong, and where do you think they fell short?
Well,
what do you think he was up to?
Well, first, I think a very small part of the speech was actually about influence operations by China. It was more broadly about concerns we have about China. So we talked about Chinese policy toward Taiwan and the South China Sea and a range of things that China is doing.
But the influence arguments were new, right? I mean, there's been lots of speeches before by politicians about those other
President Trump,
things.
of course, had raised this issue of Chinese interference at the UN General Assembly. And that was the first time that we heard anybody, not to mention the president, talk about this. And it was then revealed shortly thereafter that Vice President Pence was going to give a speech that would address this. So yes, he talked about the targeted tariffs, and he talked about the inserts in particularly the Des Moines Register. And he talked about a Chinese circular that had been sent out to propaganda organs about how they should shape the narrative. And this is, of course, what China does best and most frequently is try and shape the narrative around the world to make it more pro-China, to get people to support China's positions. But I still think the jury is out on whether or not there has been interference in the form of what people charge that the Russians have done. And sometimes people are talking about the 2016 elections, and other times there's been implications about the next presidential elections in 2020. So perhaps, yes, there is growing evidence that there was Russian interference in these elections. And the way that the Russians, as I understand, people who've studied the differences between the way the Russians engage in these kind of influence and interference operations, is that they are more targeted and more they're operationalized, and there may have been some hacking into actual voting machines. Nobody has provided yet any evidence that the Chinese did that in 2016. We have 2 years until our elections. Of course, there could be evidence. We could find, if our intelligence community is doing a deep dive, that there's some cyber element to the way that China is even promoting influence here. That, I think, would be worrisome. There have been reports recently that the Trump administration has indeed done this kind of research. They've done their due diligence, and we are waiting for a report to be released on this. But this has been reported in our media that there is such a report that is forthcoming. So I think President Pence did not really provide evidence of what I would call illegitimate, illegal, or what Clive referred to as coercive, covert, or corrupting. But I don't rule out that is taking place. We have to ensure that our Congress, our intelligence communities, our executive branch are paying attention to these issues. We have to protect the integrity of our democratic institutions, and all democracies have to do that. And I was in Taiwan last week, and I have to tell you that they are at the front on this as a target of influence operations and interference operations. And because their language is Chinese, they are especially vulnerable. And the Chinese use Taiwan as a test bed for these kind of operations. So I think that this is something we have to be more aware of.
Can I just add, there's a lot to be said here. I think there's a real danger in getting the China issue tangled up in the Russian election meddling for lots of reasons. First of all, Vice President Pence's speech was not a political gambit. It was reflecting things that are actually going on based on intelligence evidence that's been developed over some years. And I think it's a grave disservice for people to, look, I'm no Trump fan, I come from the left, but, this is a serious problem that the US has to face in the same way that Australia has to face it. And it's a grave disservice for critics of Trump and Pence and so on to characterise Pence's speech as an attempt to distract attention from the Russia investigation. It's not. It's a much more serious problem than that. And so, building on that, it's also a mistake, in my view, to attempt to see China's influence operations through the lens of Russian meddling in elections. I don't think you will find evidence of China meddling in American elections. I really don't. That's not their modus operandi. They're more subtle, they're more long-term than that. Don't go looking there, because you won't find anything. But you'll fail to see what really is going on, which is much more long-term, much more subtle, much more aimed not at manipulating election systems, but at influencing people, at making friends within the elites. And so, put it this way, Russia's GDP, this is figures of about 2 years ago, was $1.3 trillion. Guess what Australia's GDP was in that same year? $1.3 trillion, the same as Russia. China's was 10 times bigger. It's growing more rapidly. The gap is increasing. It's in all likelihood, unless something unexpected happens, the GDP of China will exceed that of the United States in a decade or so. So China is the issue. Vladimir Putin has a short-term objective of creating chaos and disruption. Beyond that, he doesn't know what he wants. The PRC has a far more long-term, subtle, carefully thought-through objective of gaining influence. It doesn't want to disrupt the institutions. It doesn't want to undermine democracy. It wants to control the practices, the institutions, the people involved in the exercise of democracy. So don't go looking for China's long-term influence strategy in Russia's disruption of the last presidential election. That would be my advice.
Okay, I want to open it up to questions from the audience. Right here in the front, we'll pass you a microphone and ask you to introduce yourself briefly.
Mike Pacetic, PBS Online NewsHour. You mentioned that the former Prime Minister was here last week. And first of all, you might describe him as the latest victim of political chaos in Australia. But he did say that he thought even if there was a change in parties, that basic Australian policy would go forward. Do you see the Shorten and the Labour Party as perhaps more vulnerable or more sympathetic to China than the Liberal coalition?
Thank you. It's a question I think about a lot, and I think the answer is yes. I do worry that a shortened Labor government, which seems very likely in the next election, which will be no later than May of next year, we will have a Labor government. The legislation which has passed Parliament has been bipartisan, which is a very good sign. The parliamentary inquiry that recommended the legislation should go through with amendments was bipartisan, which is a good sign. But it's also true that the PRC has targeted the Labor Party for influence operations in Australia. It has a great deal of influence within sections of the Labor Party, particularly the New South Wales right, the right wing of the Labor Party in New South Wales, where most of the trouble has been for Labor. I should stress that there are very good people in the Labor Party who fully recognise the China influence problem in Australia, and so there's an arm wrestle going on within the Labor Party over this issue. There are some very worrying indications, however, that some senior people in the shadow ministry of the Labor Party who will become senior ministers really don't think that the threat is that great, really think that this whole pushback is driven by the paranoia of the intelligence security services. There's quite a strong element of anti-Americanism within the Labor Party, which does see the rise of China as a helpful bulwark against the power of the United States. And so there is a deep concern that some of us have that the Labor Party may indeed take its foot off the accelerator and not, for example, prosecute people under the new foreign interference legislation.
Other questions? This woman in the front here.
Jennifer Zheng from the Epoch Times. I have actually 3 questions. One is, any lessons the United States should learn from Australia's experience? Are there specific policies that the United States should adopt? The second question is, there has been a lot of attention this year in Australia to the problem of Chinese interference. Are things starting to turn around there? If so, why? And the third question, maybe you've already talked about a little bit. I wonder if you can expand a little bit more on why are the Chinese seeking to subvert other countries around the world? Thank you.
Well, they're big questions. Let me give short answers if I can. Well, I think particularly under Xi Jinping, a view has crystallised that China can return to its Middle Kingdom status and be the dominant power in the world. I think there's, it's a very kind of paranoid and fragile regime, so that's characterised as its strength. But there's also a strong sense amongst the dominant people within the CCP that China can achieve this objective of becoming not only the economically dominant power, but the technologically and in time militarily dominant power. And in order to do that, it's within the DNA of the CCP not just to exert its power in the way that powers traditionally have, but to use its united front and other techniques to to undermine the will to resist on the part of its enemies. Classic Sun Tzu. What can the United States learn from Australia? Well, a lot, and there's been a great deal of exchange between the two countries among intelligence people, for example, and amongst diplomats, State Department, Foreign Affairs people. There's a great deal of dialogue going on to see what can be learned. If I were to suggest one thing, it would be there's one big difference in the state of the debate between the US and Australia, and that is public awareness. About 2 years ago, there was a process of awakening of the Australian public broadly about the extent and nature of PRC influence operations in Australia. And so the public is fully on board, strongly backing the legislation. There are critics, of course, and there's a very dynamic debate going on. I mean, I get attacked by all sorts of people, including my comrades from the left. Some of them. It seems to me in the United States, there's a strong understanding among some elements of the elites now in the administration, and also the adults in the room in the White House, the intelligence services, security services, defence. Some China analysts get it. There is a small handful of journalists that get it and are working on it. But I think the broader American public has a long way to go before it understands, in the wake of the Russia issue, that in fact the PRC is a far greater threat subversive threat to the United States. And I just say this one thing. I think the foreign interference legislation that Australia adopted in June really is world leading. And a lot of other countries are looking very closely at what we've done and whether it will work. And it's too early to know whether it will work, but it wouldn't surprise me, because this is a new thing. This foreign interference. It's not some old Cold War thing we've suddenly recognised. This is a new thing that Australia has defined in law and applied very heavy penalties against, which is why many of us are looking forward to the first prosecutions, and it's something the United States might want to consider.
Bonnie, anything you want to add, especially on the question about why is China seeking to?
I don't disagree with Clive that China is seeking to influence publics, wants to create a narrative that's more favorable to China, and maybe potentially even buy off elites where it can do that. Mm-hmm. We have seen in places like Australia, places like New Zealand, where there have been members of parliament who have accepted money, political campaign contributions from China, and then advocated on behalf of Chinese policies. Again, I challenge anybody to find that kind of evidence here. I've yet to see a member of Congress elected who we have come up with evidence has taken money from China and pushing a Chinese agenda. So I think although I actually agree we are in the US to some extent playing catch up. Australia started looking into this 10 years ago and had really done some very deep investigation. I still would argue that we don't have, as in Clive's words, the extent and nature of the problem here is not the same. And there are areas where we do need to address them, but I don't think they're similar. And if I had to make a suggestion about US policy, it would be at least to take a look at at FARA, the Foreign Agents Registration Act, and ensure it is up to date, and even more importantly, ensure that it's enforced. Apparently, it isn't always, it is very rarely actually applied. People are very rarely fined, penalized, because they're in violation. Now, people may know it was just a few weeks ago that CCTV was actually forced to register the Department of Justice, made them register. But Russia's propaganda organ had been previously asked to register. So these kinds of steps, I think, are good. They're important. We need to make sure that our laws are up to date and they are being enforced.
Are there any other, so you've pointed to a number of areas where legislation and regulation that we have in this country provides some degree of protection or mitigation against some of these influence activities. But are there any other differences that you'd want to point to that may make the United States less vulnerable? I mean, the Chinese diaspora, for example, we both have Chinese diaspora citizens of Australia and the United States that are of Chinese ethnic heritage, but I think it's much larger in Australia.
If you look at the percentage of the population, far larger in Australia, absolutely. And let's go back to one of Clive's initial statements, that China is seeking to drive a wedge between the U.S. and Australia, that sees Australia as a weak link.
Right.
That's obviously not the goal in the United States.
Right.
So they would like to influence the narrative here and policies where possible.
Right.
But I find that there's been enormous pushback here already by people who are in, to some extent, academia, think tanks, government,
businesses,
Congress,
too.
Business, against some of the messaging and the efforts that, and certainly activities, policies that China has been implementing. So it doesn't, I don't think it has the same resonance here as it has
It
in
also strikes me
Australia.
that the business composition is different in the sense that, Australia has a lot of economic dependence on China in terms of exports of raw materials, mining, et cetera. And that's a different proposition from American businesses that are largely focused on investing in China, including in high-tech sectors and other kinds of manufacturing, which makes it perhaps more difficult. The United States business community has faced a lot of obstacles, and hence the Trump trade agenda is largely focused, as Vice President's speech outlined, on dealing with intellectual property theft and other kinds of issues, restrictions in the Chinese economy. So the business community here has gotten very fed up with China.
We've had a sea change in thinking.
And of course it's not unanimous, it's not uniform, but there's been a growing consensus among the business community that you have to confront China. And I think it's very different in Australia. Clive, do you want to remark on that?
Yes, what you say is true. But it's also true in Australia that, there are many powerful apologists for Beijing in the Australian business community. I'm quite shocked at just how blatant some of them can be. Let me tell you a little incident that I got from an impeccable source. When Liu Xiaobo, the Nobel Prize winning writer, was dying, Australia said nothing, as most countries did. Said nothing about his captivity, incarceration. And then when he died, our Foreign Minister, Julie Bishop, issued a very anodyne statement saying that Australia regrets the death of Liu Xiaobo. And as soon as she did so, she received phone calls from, I'm told, 3 billionaires and 2 vice-chancellors, that's university presidents, saying, Foreign Minister, this is a very silly thing to do, to issue this statement, because Beijing is very upset and you must withdraw it straight away, which was, you kind of expect it from mining billionaires who don't have a moral compass. But vice-chancellors, these are men, I'm pretty certain the 2 in question were men, who are the guardians of the Western University. These are the institutions that ought to protect the speaking of the truth above all else. That was a deeply disturbing event when I heard about it. But I just want to kind of respond a little bit to develop Bonnie's point. There are certain weaknesses that Australia has that the United States doesn't have. But what that means is that Beijing will be looking for the weaknesses that it can use and exploit to influence and otherwise subdue the United States. And they are its allies. The United States needs friends. It ought not to be news, but the United States can't do this alone. The United States must have allies. I'm thinking particularly in the Indo-Pacific region in order to maintain its position and the position that its allies want it to maintain. Canada is a great worry for the United States. The extent of Beijing's influence in Canada is intense. And this is a weakness for the United States in all sorts of ways. You know, Five Eyes is one. Canada is seriously considering allowing Huawei to build or use its equipment to build its 5G network. The other Four Eyes are going to be extremely reluctant in the way they share intelligence with Canada if Huawei is involved in building the 5G network in Canada. But also, I'll just make this other point about, yeah, business in the United States is sick of being exploited and having its technology ripped off, but that's not stopping Google looking for ways of developing technology that will assist Beijing not only censor but spy on its own citizens. And I thought it was extremely interesting that Vice President Pence called out Google for that and said, stop helping dictators. And now, you know, these are capitalist enterprises. They might be annoyed with Beijing for ripping off their technology, but that doesn't mean they're not going to cooperate with Beijing if an opportunity comes along to make more money.
Okay, we have time for probably one last question. I'll go to here, Marvin. Keep your hand up, Marvin, so they know we're there. There you go. Okay.
Thank you. Just want to say this has been a remarkably good session. I mean, really, really interesting. Marvin Ott, formerly federal government, now Johns Hopkins and Woodrow Wilson Center. Quick question. There's been a sort of long thesis, I think,
I'm thinking academics, university administrators kind of innocently believe that they are bringing people from an oppressive country and they'll come to the West and they'll learn the wonders of free speech and the democratic practices and so on, and then they'll take back these liberalising ideas. I mean, this is demonstrably wrong. There have been studies that have shown that China, regrettably, I mean, it's deeply regrettable, all this we should say, but that Chinese students who come to the United States or Australia go back more patriotic towards the motherland than when they came. And it ought to be said that one of the kind of regrettable consequences of the pushback that's coming and the greater social awareness in Australia is that Chinese students in Australia will start to feel more besieged. I mean, Beijing and the embassies and the consulates already work very hard at making them believe that they are isolated, they need to rely on the embassy, the consulates and their fellow Chinese students in order to survive in Australia or the United States. And that's probably going to intensify. But to the extent that they do go back with a better understanding, not very many of them study politics in the United States or the humanities, where they're more likely to get a good understanding of how the system works. And they tend, and there are definitely exceptions, and we should help and celebrate those who do come to places like the United States to learn these things. But for the most part, their kind of prejudices are reinforced when they hear people in the West say that Taiwan ought to be an independent country, or that the Dalai Lama is not a splittist who runs an evil cult. They tend to think that they are being the subject of propaganda, and they're more likely to believe Beijing. So unfortunately, the liberalising objective of bringing Chinese students here doesn't work except in a few cases.
Okay, I'll take one more question. Over here in the back, I haven't taken it in the back.
Hi, thank you so much. I'd like to echo that. I think it's been a great event. I wanted to say that, draw attention to the World Artificial Intelligence Conference that also recently happened in Shanghai. And I appreciate you already mentioning Google's projects and the fact that the VPOTUS mentioned Google's investments in China and developing a new search engine there. But it isn't entirely true that Silicon Valley has bought into the great power competition message that's emanating from Washington and maybe has been somewhat acculturated on Wall Street. So I'm wondering, do you see the potential for future research in areas like Silicon Valley and the influence of Chinese United Front Work Department activities in the United States' tech hub?
Well, let me comment briefly. I'm sure Bonnie probably knows more about this than I do. But we've talked about how the diaspora in the United States is proportionally much smaller than in Australia and Canada. But it's also very concentrated in certain areas, geographically, but also industrially, and Silicon Valley is one of it. I mean, Silicon Valley was targeted by Beijing, as well as independent entrepreneurial Chinese people who went there to make their fortunes. And what I haven't studied intensively, but I've done a little bit of work on the way in which in Silicon Valley, as happens in Australia, there are ethnic Chinese professional associations, which are United Front organisations. And these ways of attempting to, and very effectively, control Chinese experts and entrepreneurs in ways that benefit Beijing. And I think that's an area which requires a great deal of attention. Investigative journalism would be, would be extremely productive, focused on there. And of course, what Beijing is now doing through its 1,000 Talents program and similar ones is working extremely hard to bring the best talent back to China, because they now believe, with good reason, that they have the critical mass and the infrastructure in order to carry out the cutting-edge technological developments themselves. So there's now a brain drain going the other way.
I'd just like to add briefly that I think we have to make some distinctions here. One distinction is between hypothesizing what they could be doing and having evidence of what China's actually doing. So we might think about all of the things they could be doing in Silicon Valley, or trying to influence potential political candidates. Anything's possible. But I do think we really have to ensure that we have evidence, and we should look for it. And I think that there are people in this country who are doing this kind of work, investigative journalists included. Secondly, we have to distinguish between the efforts that are actually taking place and the efficacy. Are they really having an impact? There may be some places where they are, and we should be worried about it. Maybe we should think about legislation, or we should just ensure things are transparent. But I can give you many examples where I see efforts, including think tanks, where I just don't see much efficacy. And so I think that we have to be careful to stick to the facts.
Thank you. Well, I think this has been a really interesting discussion, and what I take away from it is that a lot more empirical research needs to be done, especially in the United States and other countries. And I think we're going to be hearing some research that's coming out in this event next week in the Freeman Chair. But I think it'll be an area to keep our eyes on going forward. So please join me in thanking Clive Hamilton and Bonnie Glaser.
Thank you.
Thank you.